June 1944. The city of Minsk shimmered under a blanket of summer heat, its streets deceptively calm. Cafes opened their shutters, trams rattled down cobblestone roads, and officers in gray-green uniforms sipped black coffee on terraces still scarred from the bombings of years before. To the Germans who held the city, Minsk was no longer a battlefield. It was a fortress, a symbol of control carved deep into Soviet land. Hitler had declared it untouchable, the cornerstone of his Eastern Front. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch, occupied Belarus like a clenched iron fist. They had built bunkers into hillsides, dug trenches that seemed to stretch forever, and filled warehouses with ammunition and supplies for a long war that, to them, was already half won. Maps on their walls told them they were safe. German reconnaissance showed no significant Soviet movement nearby. Their intelligence officers swore the next major offensive would come from Ukraine, hundreds of miles south. In Minsk, they believed themselves spectators, not targets. Radio broadcasts from Berlin called the city the Shield of the East. In his office near Independence Avenue, Busch reviewed reports and signed off on orders for additional fortifications. He was tired but confident, his trust placed in the rigid geometry of defense lines. Trenches, wire, minefields, artillery belts. Behind him, a portrait of the Führer hung beneath a swastika banner. Outside, soldiers marched in columns through Victory Square, boots striking the pavement in perfect rhythm. There was order, discipline, and the illusion of permanence. At night, Minsk glowed faintly from blackout lamps. Officers dined in the former governor's palace, its marble halls echoing with piano music, and the laughter of men convinced of their own endurance. They toasted victories long past. Stalingrad forgotten, Kursk dismissed as a temporary setback. A colonel wrote to his wife in Dresden, assuring her the Russians were broken. "We've turned the tide. Their factories can't keep up. Soon they'll beg for peace." His words were steady, his penmanship elegant, the confidence of a soldier who had seen years of war without understanding its rhythm. That stillness always comes before collapse. But outside the city, in forests so dense that even sunlight struggled to reach the ground, another kind of order was forming. Soviet soldiers lay silent under camouflage nets woven from pine branches. The air smelled of sap, oil, and tension. Columns of T-34 tanks were parked under trees, their engines cold, their crews waiting for a signal that had not yet come. Red Army officers whispered over maps spread across the hoods of trucks, marking routes with gloved fingers. Entire divisions were concealed within the Belarusian wilderness. Men, guns, fuel, armor, invisible to the sky. When German reconnaissance planes flew overhead at dawn, they saw only trees and quiet rivers, unaware that beneath that calm waited an army larger than any they had ever faced. In the German headquarters, the sense of danger had faded. They spoke of their fortresses, Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, as immovable stones against the Soviet tide. Hitler's voice on the telephone had been clear. Not one step back. These cities are to stand to the last man. The order carried the weight of divine command. Engineers reinforced bunkers, anti-tank guns were placed at every road approach, and officers reassured their men that no force could penetrate the Belarusian balcony. They didn't know that Stalin and Zhukov had already chosen that balcony as the point of collapse. The forests around Minsk hid more than men. They hid intention. Bridges had been quietly repaired under the cover of night. Supply lines stretched like veins across swamps and valleys. Soviet signals officers listened to German radio chatter, charting every word, every call for ammunition or fuel. To them, Minsk was not a fortress. It was a tomb being built brick by its occupants. The plan was not to attack it head-on, but to surround it, starve it, and erase it, to make it disappear as though it had never existed. In the early hours of June 22nd, a warm wind carried the scent of rain through the forests. Soviet officers stood outside their command posts, smoking silently, eyes fixed on the horizon. The world seemed to hold its breath. In Minsk, officers prepared for another ordinary day of inspections and reports. Field Marshal Bush dictated a message to Berlin, praising the efficiency of his divisions. "Our lines are firm. Our morale excellent." He signed it with a flourish, sealing his own fate in ink. As dawn broke over Belarus, the city basked in deceptive calm. Children chased stray dogs in the courtyards. Bakers pulled fresh loaves from ovens, and church bells echoed faintly through the haze. No one in Minsk could see the shadows gathering beyond the tree line. The armored columns, the endless rows of artillery guns, the millions of men ready to move. The Red Army waited only for the clock to strike 4. Then, the earth itself would open. For months, the Soviets had been weaving a curtain of lies so complete that even their own soldiers did not fully see the scale of it. In Ukraine, hundreds of miles away from the real target, engineers hammered together an army made of air and wood. Inflatable tanks gleamed under the sun, their rubber hides painted with shadows to fool reconnaissance cameras. Artillery pieces were carved from pine logs, positioned beside painted fuel drums. Dummy camps stretched for miles, fake latrines, fake cook fires, even straw mannequins in uniform moving with the wind. Radio operators filled the air with phantom orders. "Send ammunition to Sector 12. Fuel convoy delayed by rain." They broadcasted them on frequencies the Germans had long ago broken. Each message was bait, and German intelligence swallowed it whole. Meanwhile, deep in the forests of Belarus, the real army disappeared from the sky. Aerial photographs showed nothing but trees, rivers, and empty ground. Yet beneath that canopy hid 1.7 million Soviet soldiers, 5,000 tanks, and nearly 70,000 vehicles. They had been gathering there since March, silently, methodically, under orders so strict that even letters home were forbidden. No fires were allowed after dusk. No voices rose above whispers. If a truck left tracks in the dirt, soldiers swept them away with pine branches before dawn. German pilots flying reconnaissance at sunrise saw only pristine earth and calm rivers. Not the largest offensive force in human history waiting just beneath their wings. The deception was a masterpiece of what the Soviets called maskirovka, the art of making truth invisible. Stalin had learned its power early in 1941 when German panzers rolled through the same lands in weeks. Now he would use deception as a weapon sharper than steel. To the south, German commanders counted the fake armies in Ukraine and moved their reserves to meet a blow that would never come. In the north, Field Marshal Rokossovsky waited among the birches, his division silent, his orders sealed. He carried maps of German positions so detailed that they showed individual gun emplacements and field kitchens. Gifts from partisan scouts who had risked everything to feed Moscow's intelligence machine. On the night of June 21st, the forests were restless. Convoys rolled without headlights, guided only by the glow of cigarette tips and the faint shimmer of moonlight on wet metal. Tank crews slept beside their machines, wrapped in blankets that smelled of oil and frost. In command tents lit by kerosene lamps, generals leaned over maps covered in grease pencil lines. Each arrow represented a storm about to break. Rokossovsky, calm and exact, murmured to his staff, "Tomorrow we take their heart. Once it stops, the rest will die on its own." Hundreds of miles away in Minsk, German officers attended the opera. A soprano sang over the hum of electric fans as champagne glasses clinked. One colonel whispered that the Russians had exhausted themselves at Sevastopol. Another joked that Stalin was too busy replacing his generals to plan an attack. Outside, the air was heavy with summer heat, the kind that makes men slow and careless. They did not see the horizon flicker faintly with distant lightning. Not thunderclouds, but the reflection of artillery flashes too far to hear. In a field north of Orsha, Soviet artillerymen unwrapped the long barrels of their guns, each one aligned by compass. Ammunition wagons arrived silently, the horses' hooves wrapped in cloth. At 3 a.m., officers walked down the gun lines, checking elevation, distance, and fuse time. One of them, a young lieutenant from Smolensk, touched the barrel of his cannon and whispered, "For my village." He had not seen it since the Germans burned it 3 years ago. In the darkness before dawn, Soviet tank commanders climbed into their turrets. Radios crackled once, then fell silent. Orders were written on paper, passed hand to hand. No voice transmissions, not one. The deception was so absolute that even now, on the edge of the largest offensive since the war began, the Red Army remained invisible to the enemy that believed itself invincible. At headquarters, Rokossovsky lit a cigarette and looked at his watch. It was nearly 4. He turned to his aide and said almost softly, "Let the curtain rise." The signal flares went up, red, green, white, streaking across the sky like meteors. Seconds later, the night shattered. Thousands of guns opened fire at once, the sound folding into itself until it became a single endless roar. Trees shook. The ground lifted. The air turned solid with noise. The Germans had no warning, no time, no sense of direction. Only the sudden understanding that the forests they thought were empty had just come alive. And as dawn spread across the horizon, Minsk slept on, unaware that the storm that would erase it had already begun to move. At exactly 4 in the morning on June 23, 1944, the earth itself began to scream. For weeks, the forests of Belarus had whispered with invisible movement, and now, all at once, they spoke. From Vitebsk to Bobruisk, over a front stretching nearly 500 miles, Soviet artillery unleashed the largest bombardment Europe had ever heard. The sound was not like thunder. It was continuous, rolling, layered, as if the air itself had turned to fire. German trenches disintegrated. Command posts vanished in clouds of dirt and smoke. Men stumbled from bunkers half-deaf, choking on dust. One German survivor later wrote, "It felt as though the ground was breathing, and we were inside its lungs." The Soviet attack had begun under the name Operation Bagration, but to the men on the ground it was something else. A cataclysm. More than 5,000 artillery pieces fired in perfect synchronization. Entire forests glowed red from the muzzle flashes. Smoke rose in walls so high that daylight dimmed to twilight. German radio operators tried to send reports, but the lines were dead. The first shells had already severed their cables. For many German units, the last words ever transmitted were fragments, coordinates, orders to hold, pleas for air support that would never come. At 4:20 a.m., the Soviet infantry advanced behind the barrage, moving through smoke and flame. They carried bayonets, flamethrowers, and the kind of silence only discipline gives. Behind them, the tanks came, thousands of them, rolling through the haze like shadows made of metal. T-34s and IS-2s thundered across minefields, engineers clearing the way with their bodies if they had to. Officers shouted into megaphones that could barely be heard over the bombardment. "Forward! Keep moving forward!" The German front lines broke before sunrise. Entire battalions disappeared under shell fire. Observation posts that had watched the horizon for years were now craters filled with smoke. By the time Field Marshal Bush received the first reports, his map of Army Group Center was already a relic. The divisions he thought were there no longer existed. He tried to call Berlin, but the telephone lines had been cut by partisans in the night. When he finally reached Hitler's headquarters by radio, his voice was trembling. "The Russians are attacking everywhere," he said. "We must fall back or—" Static swallowed the rest. In the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler listened without emotion. His advisors urged him to permit tactical withdrawal, but he refused. "These fortress cities were built to hold," he said coldly. "Minsk will not fall, not one step back." His belief in fortresses was no longer strategy, it was superstition. He imagined the cities as anchors that could hold reality in place, even as the sea of war shifted beneath them. But in Belarus, reality was dissolving. By mid-morning, Soviet tank columns had advanced 20 miles. The shock was total. German officers emerging from bunkers found their supply depots burning, their roads jammed with retreating vehicles, their men wandering without orders. Soviet aircraft filled the sky. Yak fighters and Il-2 Sturmovix strafing everything that moved. A German anti-aircraft crew near Orsha managed to shoot down 2 planes before being buried alive by artillery fire. In the chaos, some German soldiers turned their guns on themselves rather than be captured. In a ruined farmhouse near the Dnieper River, A young Soviet radio operator named Mikhail Frolov set up his transmitter. His fingers shook as he tapped out the prearranged signal. "The wall is breaking." His commander, General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, read the message and smiled for the first time in months. The offensive was working faster than even Stalin had predicted. The deception, the silence, the fake armies in Ukraine, it had all paid off. The Germans were blind. By noon, Soviet armor was pushing through the gaps like water through cracks in stone. Every attempt by German reserves to form new defensive lines collapsed before they even began. "They are everywhere," one surviving officer radioed. "Behind us, beside us, inside our positions." But no one heard him. His message was lost in the flood of other desperate transmissions. The 3rd Panzer Army tried to counterattack at Vitebsk, but Soviet tanks outflanked them within hours. Survivors abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot. The fields were littered with burning wrecks, the sky streaked with black smoke. As night fell, the Red Army had advanced 35 miles in a single day. Columns of prisoners stumbled eastward under armed guard, their faces blank with exhaustion and disbelief. The Germans had been trained to see the Red Army as clumsy and disorganized, incapable of rapid maneuver. But what they faced now was something transformed, coordinated, precise, merciless. In Minsk, the officers who had laughed at the opera 2 nights earlier sat awake in their bunkers, listening to distant thunder. Reports from the front made no sense. Entire divisions lost contact. Artillery firing on own positions. No orders from headquarters. One colonel unfolded his map and found that the front line, his front line, had vanished entirely. He poured himself a glass of schnapps with shaking hands and muttered, "It's impossible. It's impossible." But it was happening. All across Belarus, the German army that had once seemed eternal was being erased hour by hour. By the end of the 2nd day, more than 50,000 soldiers were dead or captured, and the road to Minsk lay open. In the darkness beyond the city, the sound of Soviet tanks rolled like distant thunder, growing closer with every breath. By the dawn of June 24, 1944, the German front in Belarus was no longer a line. It was a wound. Entire regiments had vanished into the forests. Command posts stood silent, and the roads westward were jammed with chaos. Broken trucks, dead horses, and columns of men moving without direction. Smoke rose in pillars from the ruins of Vitebsk and Orsha, where Hitler's fortress cities had lasted less than 48 hours. From the air, Soviet reconnaissance crews described the landscape as a field of ghosts. Down below, German survivors dug shallow trenches with their helmets, firing at shadows that moved faster than their eyes could follow. Field Marshal Bush, once proud commander of Army Group Center, now paced inside a farmhouse that had become his headquarters. His face was gray, his uniform soaked with sweat. "We have lost contact with the 4th Army," an aide stammered. "The 9th Army reports encirclement near Bobruisk. We can't reach them by radio." Bush pressed his palms to the table. "Then drive there yourself," he said. "Find them." Outside, engines roared, the last of his staff cars fleeing west. In Berlin, his requests for retreat met the same single-word response from Hitler's office: "Hold." But the word "hold" meant nothing now. The Red Army wasn't attacking from a single direction. It was folding the German front inward from every side. Rokossovsky's northern divisions moved like a blade through the forests, cutting deep behind the lines. To the south, General Konstantin Chernyakovsky's tanks swept through the open plains, bypassing strong points, sealing off roads, slicing communications. In the air, Soviet Yak-9 fighters strafed convoys and bombed bridges. The Luftwaffe tried to answer, but there were fewer than 50 operational fighters left across the entire front. By midday, the sky belonged entirely to the Soviets. At Bobruisk, General Jordan's corps found itself trapped. 70,000 men, 20,000 vehicles, no clear orders. The Soviet artillery had turned the swamps around the city into boiling mud. German units trying to retreat west found the bridges already in flames. Jordan radioed, "Request permission to break out." The answer from Hitler's headquarters was ice cold. "Bobruisk is a fortress. Fortresses do not retreat. The next shell landed on the building that held the transmitter. Inside Minsk, officers tried to maintain an illusion of control. They drew new defensive lines on maps that no longer matched reality. They reassured each other that reinforcements would arrive from the west. But the trains had stopped. The tracks were gone, the bridges dynamited by partisans, Soviet saboteurs, farmers by day, killers by night, had severed every artery connecting the city to the rest of the Reich. The fortress was already an island, and the tide was rising fast. On the evening of June 25th, Field Marshal Busch finally managed to reach Hitler by telephone. Static crackled between them. "Mein Führer, if we don't withdraw now, we will lose the entire army group center." There was a long silence, then Hitler's voice, calm and detached. "Nonsense. You exaggerate as usual. The Russians will break upon our fortress cities like waves upon rock." Busch looked at his trembling hand holding the receiver and realized there would be no help, no logic, no salvation. When the line went dead, he whispered to his aide, "Then the rocks will drown." That night, the Soviet advance accelerated. Armor spearheads raced 50 miles in 3 days, faster than the Germans had moved during their invasion of 1941. German officers who had survived Stalingrad said they had never seen anything like it. Tanks appeared where no roads existed. Infantry columns emerged from swamps the Germans thought impassable. One captured officer confessed, "They were everywhere. We fought the forests themselves." By June 26th, Vitebsk had fallen. The German commander there, General Gallwitzer, was taken prisoner with what remained of his staff. Soviet photographers filmed the smoking ruins, the shattered emblems of the Reich still hanging from blackened buildings. In the footage, one could see a Soviet soldier plant a red flag atop a church dome that had been used as a sniper post. The wind tore it, but it stayed. Further south at Bobruisk, the siege became a massacre. When the Soviets finally stormed the city, they found streets choked with the dead, Germans and civilians alike. The river ran dark with oil and blood. One Soviet cameraman later wrote, "I have filmed 3 years of war, but never death like this." The city screamed even after it was silent. Only a handful of Germans broke out. The rest vanished into the smoke. That same evening in Minsk, officers gathered in the underground command post to discuss their next move. A captain from the 12th Panzer Division laid his map on the table, his hands shaking. "Comrades," he said bitterly, "we are the map." Above them, the faint sound of distant explosions rolled through the night. The front was moving toward them, fast. The following morning, June 27th, the first Soviet patrols crossed the Berezina River. The same river Napoleon's army had bled across in retreat more than a century earlier. History was repeating, but this time it was the Germans who fled westward, their columns burning behind them. The Soviet vanguard reached the outskirts of Borisov and paused only to refuel. Ahead of them lay Minsk, Hitler's fortress city, the heart of Army Group Center. Inside those walls waited 100,000 German soldiers, who still believed their orders mattered. In the forests east of the city, the Red Army spread out like a closing fist. Zhukov's tanks in the north, Rokossovsky's in the south, Chernyakovsky's in the center, each converging toward a single point. The trap was ready. Minsk, once the proud jewel of the German East, was about to vanish from the map. By June 28, 1944, Minsk, the so-called fortress city, was already trembling beneath distant thunder. Soviet spearheads were closing from 3 sides, cutting off the last escape routes that led west. Inside the city, 100,000 German soldiers dug in amid rubble and tram lines, turning schools into bunkers and churches into ammunition depots. Civilians watched silently as engineers built barricades from trolleys and paving stones. Hitler's orders still hung in the air like a curse. Minsk must hold to the last man. In reality, there were no lines left to hold. Beyond the city limits, the Red Army was moving faster than history could record it. To the north, Rokossovsky's armor surged through the forests like thunderclouds made of steel. In the south, Chernyakovsky's infantry crossed the Berezina River on makeshift bridges of wrecked vehicles. They were no longer fighting for ground. They were closing a trap. By nightfall, Minsk was encircled. The German command called it a temporary setback. The men in the trenches called it what it was, the end. As darkness fell, flares turned the sky white. Soviet artillery batteries began their methodical rhythm. 2 minutes of fire, 10 seconds of silence, 2 minutes again. Each pause tricked the defenders into raising their heads. Each resumption erased another block of the city. Buildings folded like paper. The cathedral spire collapsed in a blossom of sparks. In the command bunker under Independence Square, General Eduard von Sauken read the latest situation report. No contact with the Ninth Army. No fuel. No air cover. His adjutant whispered, "Shall we ask for permission to withdraw?" Von Sauken shook his head. "There is nowhere left to withdraw to." Outside the city, Soviet loudspeakers blared through the night. "Lay down your arms. Minsk is surrounded. Resistance is useless." The broadcasts alternated with music, slow, haunting Russian waltzes that drifted through the smoke. Some German soldiers fired at the speakers in rage. Others simply listened. One sergeant tore the insignia from his cap and muttered, "We are ghosts now." At dawn on June 29th, Soviet tanks entered the outskirts. The first T-34s rolled down cobblestone streets, littered with wreckage and burning horses. German machine guns chattered from upper windows until flamethrowers silenced them. House by house, room by room, the Red Army advanced. The fighting became so close that bayonets replaced bullets. In one street, Soviet medics worked beside German captives to carry the wounded into cellars, where the air stank of plaster and blood. By midday, organized resistance collapsed. General Jordan's remnants tried to break out west toward the village of Molodechno, but Soviet armor cut them down in open fields. Aerial observers described the battlefield as a single moving shadow. When evening came, Minsk burned without sound. The fire consumed oxygen faster than wind could replace it, and the city seemed to breathe, exhaling smoke in long, heavy sighs. In the Soviet command post east of the city, Zhukov received the final report. Minsk secured. Enemy divisions annihilated or captured. Estimated prisoners, over 100,000. He leaned over the map, tracing the circle around the city with a grease pencil. "Close it," he said. "No one leaves." That night, the glow of the burning city was visible from 60 miles away. Soviet soldiers watched in silence. One of them, a private from Smolensk, wrote in his diary, "The city burned like a candle for the souls of the dead. We did not cheer. We just watched." When dawn returned on June 30th, only fragments of the fortress remained. Stone shells, blackened trees, and columns of prisoners stumbling through the smoke. The siege of Minsk had lasted barely 3 days. For the Germans who survived, it was not a battle, but an erasure. For the Soviets, it was proof that the balance of the war had shifted forever. The city that Hitler swore would never fall was now a graveyard for 500,000 men. And the Red Army, unstoppable, was already moving west again, toward Poland, toward Berlin, toward the end of the Reich itself. By July 1, 1944, the once mighty Army Group Center was no longer an army. It was a scattering of fugitives stumbling through the forests of Belarus. The map in Hitler's headquarters still showed neat black lines and unit symbols, but those divisions no longer existed. Minsk had fallen. The fortress he swore would never yield was silent, its streets littered with wrecked panzers and abandoned helmets. The few German units that broke west found only flames. Soviet cavalry and tanks were already waiting on the other side. From the air, Red Army reconnaissance filmed the roads leading out of the city. Endless columns of men walking in single file, hands raised, their shadows stretching across the smoke. Stalin had ordered that the world must see this victory. Camera crews followed the advancing troops, documenting not just the triumph but the transformation. A Red Army that now moved like a storm, confident, organized, and merciless. On July 3rd, Soviet spearheads entered central Minsk. The city burned quietly, its stone skeleton glowing orange in the dusk. Amid the ruins, soldiers pulled down the swastika that had hung over the governor's palace for 3 years. In its place, they raised a red flag torn from a tank's antenna. Around them, Captured Germans huddled in bombed-out courtyards. Some wept, others sat motionless, staring at the ground. A Soviet officer remarked, "We have stopped counting prisoners. There are too many to number." To the west, Hitler replaced Field Marshal Busch with Walter Model, the Führer's fireman, sent to put out infernos others had started. But when Model arrived at the front, there was nothing left to save. 31 generals were missing or dead. 90 divisions had ceased to exist. His first message to Berlin was brutally simple. Army Group Center no longer exists as a fighting force. The human cost was beyond comprehension. 500,000 Germans were dead, wounded or captured in just 23 days. Soviet engineers counted thousands of vehicles left behind. Tanks stuck in marshes, trucks out of fuel, guns still loaded but unmanned. The swamps reeked of fuel and decay. Crows gathered in flocks so large that even Soviet pilots mentioned them in reports. Black clouds over the German columns. For the Red Army, the scale of victory was staggering. They had advanced more than 450 miles in a month, liberated all of Belarus, and reached the borders of Poland. Soldiers who had once fought on their own soil now stood on the threshold of Germany. Stalin ordered church bells to ring across Moscow for the first time since 1941. Trains rolled east carrying captured weapons, entire flat cars of German artillery, tanks, and trucks, trophies of a nation that once claimed to be invincible. But triumph carried a strange silence. In the ruined fields near Borisov, a Soviet private named Mikhail Frolov finally found the courage to write home. "Mama," he wrote, "we did it. They are gone. Berlin is next." His letter, stained with mud, was carried by courier across a land that only weeks earlier had belonged to the enemy. In Berlin, propaganda ministers tried to twist the disaster into a strategic withdrawal, but even loyal officers knew the truth. A colonel wrote in his diary, "We are watching the collapse of the Eastern world. The Russians move like gods of war." On July 17th, Moscow held its parade. 57,000 German prisoners marched through the capital, officers, generals, and the shattered remains of entire divisions. They walked 20 abreast, silent, eyes lowered. Soviet citizens lined the streets in eerie quiet. Some spat, others simply stared. As the last prisoners passed, water trucks followed, hosing down the cobblestones to wash away the dust of the invaders. Operation Bagration had done more than destroy an army. It had rewritten the balance of the war. The Red Army that emerged from the forests of Belarus was no longer defensive, no longer desperate. It was a force that could reach Berlin, and everyone knew it. In 23 days, 500,000 men had vanished into history. What D-Day began in the west, Bagration completed in the east. The heart of Hitler's Eastern Empire had been ripped out, and the road to Germany now lay open. By late July 1944, the aftermath of Operation Bagration stretched across the smoking plains of Belarus like a wound that refused to close. The Germans called it the catastrophe of the East. The Soviets called it justice delayed. The reality was something darker. A military erasure so complete that even Berlin could not comprehend it. Entire German armies had vanished. Officers once famed for discipline now wandered the forests barefoot, throwing away insignia to avoid recognition. A few survivors limped west, dazed, speaking of shadows that moved like thunder and forests that spat fire. They swore the Red Army was no longer human, that it fought with the patience of nature itself. The Soviet columns that advanced beyond Minsk were unstoppable. Fuel trucks roared over the same roads German convoys had once used in triumph. Now those roads led only one way, toward the Reich. Partisan bands guided Soviet tanks through hidden trails, pointing out where mines had been buried by retreating Germans. Behind them came columns of infantry and supply vehicles, organized with precision, learned from years of defeat. Every soldier understood that this was not just a victory. It was vengeance measured in kilometers. On the edge of Minsk, Soviet engineers dug mass graves for the dead and stacked captured weapons in mountains that glinted under the sun. More than 2,000 tanks and 20,000 vehicles lay scattered across the front. Mechanics stripped them for parts, painters daubed red stars on intact machines, and within hours the enemy's steel was turned against him. A young mechanic from Leningrad told a correspondent, "We're driving their ghosts." The news from the front spread fast. In Moscow, Pravda's headlines read, "The fascist beast broken in the forests of Belarus." Posters appeared overnight showing Soviet soldiers crossing the Berezina, bayonets shining, the caption reading, "They came as conquerors. They leave as prisoners." Even Allied observers in London and Washington were astonished. American analysts compared the speed of the Soviet advance to Patton's best campaigns in the West. Only faster, deeper, deadlier. General Eisenhower himself reportedly said, "They've shattered the German center. It's over in the East." Yet for all the celebration, Stalin's orders were cold and precise. No pause, press forward. Wars are not won by resting on graves. Marshal Zhukov understood. He reorganized his exhausted divisions, rotated frontline troops, and prepared the next phase, the push into Poland. As captured German generals were interrogated in tented camps outside Smolensk, many broke down not from pain, but disbelief. General Friedrich Gollwitzer confessed, "We never imagined such deception was possible. You made us look exactly where you wanted. When we finally saw the truth, it was too late." Meanwhile, the people of Belarus emerged from hiding. Villages that had lived 3 years under occupation welcomed the Soviet soldiers with tears and silence. Old women crossed themselves beside burned barns. Children chased trucks for crumbs of bread. The liberation tasted of ash. Freedom mixed with hunger, grief, and exhaustion. One Soviet correspondent wrote, "The people smile with their mouths, but their eyes look for the ones who did not return." Farther west, the Wehrmacht tried to rebuild coherence. Hitler ordered that every able-bodied man between 16 and 60 must report for service. Posters went up promising that the Eastern Front will rise again. But the truth was obvious even in Berlin. The Reich's armies were bleeding out. Factories now worked under constant bombardment. Rail lines were broken, and fuel reserves dwindled to fumes. The myth of German invincibility had evaporated somewhere between the forests of Vitebsk and the ruins of Minsk. The Red Army paused, only long enough to count the prisoners, over 450,000, and bury its own. Then, as summer ripened into August, its armored columns turned westward once more. Ahead lay the Vistula River, Warsaw, and beyond it, Berlin. In the smoky silence after Minsk, one Soviet officer summarized what every soldier felt. "We are not chasing them anymore. We are pushing history." By August 1944, the smoke of Minsk had thinned, but its memory lingered like a scar across Europe. What had begun as a thunderclap in the forests of Belarus had ended as an apocalypse of silence. The numbers alone defied belief. 500,000 German soldiers gone, 31 divisions erased, and the backbone of Hitler's Eastern Empire shattered beyond repair. Army Group Center, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, existed now only as a phrase in a casualty report. In Berlin, the propaganda ministry worked feverishly to hide the scale of the defeat. Newspapers spoke of tactical withdrawals, of flexible defense. But letters from the front told a different story, written by survivors who had seen entire towns vanish under fire and comrades dissolve into mud. One officer's note, intercepted by Allied intelligence, read simply, "We have no front, only direction." Even Hitler's generals could no longer pretend. The map before him, once covered in confident blue lines, was now a blank expanse from Vitebsk to Warsaw, a hole punched through the heart of the Reich. The Soviet advance did not pause to celebrate. Stalin ordered his commanders to press westward toward Poland. For him, victory in Belarus was only a beginning. Each step forward now carried the weight of vengeance. For Stalingrad, for Leningrad, for 27 million Soviet dead. The Red Army rolled on, its engines rumbling like a storm that no border could contain. And behind them, in the smoldering remains of Belarus, the people began to rebuild from ashes. Villages rose again from ruin. Small huts beside burned. Churches, gardens planted in the craters of artillery shells. A Belarusian woman told a Soviet reporter, "The earth remembers everything, even the footsteps of those who freed it." Across the countryside, the dead lay where they fell, marked only by helmets or rough wooden crosses. The Soviet engineers, who buried them, kept count until the numbers became meaningless. They were no longer graves. They were geography. In Moscow, July's victory parade had already become legend. 57,000 German prisoners marched through the capital's streets, 19 generals among them, their boots striking cobblestones slick from recent rain. They walked 20 abreast, eyes down past silent crowds. No music played. No cheers rose. When the last column passed, water trucks followed, washing the street clean. The message was unmistakable. The invader had been erased, and the Red Army had taken his place in history. To Western observers, Operation Bagration seemed like a distant thunder they could hear but not see. The Allied press continued to celebrate Normandy, unaware that in the East, an even greater victory had unfolded, one that dwarfed D-Day in scale, in speed, and in consequence. For the soldiers who fought there, it needed no headlines. Private Frolov's final letter to his mother said it best, "We did not fight for glory. We fought to make sure the world wakes up one more morning free from fear." By summer's end, Soviet troops stood on the banks of the Vistula River, staring into German territory. The war had turned irreversible. The Reich was bleeding from the east and the west, and every heartbeat of its armies sounded like an echo from the past. What began as Hitler's invasion of Russia had become Stalin's retribution, a tide no command could stop. In the forests of Belarus, where the battle began, birds returned to the trees that once hid entire divisions. The wind moved through shattered branches like breath through a ghost. Locals still tell stories of the night the earth shook, of the thunder that came without rain, of the day when 500,000 men vanished into smoke. History would call it Operation Bagration. The soldiers who lived it called it something simpler, the day the Germans disappeared.